So we first met when you came to the Concord Library, I think in 1980 for that grant-funded project.
Did I meet you then?
I think I must have, oh yeah, because 7980 was my first sabbatical.
Okay.
And so I think I met you squirrel behind all the Peabody, or it was the Concord authors.
Yes, working on the Concord authors on an NEH project to generate something that could be used as online cataloging eventually when the collections.
Right. And then you came back in the early 90s.
That's when I remember meeting you. Yeah, I remember. I may have met you in 1980, but I was far more disconnected at that point from what was going on in the library. It was only in the 90s.
You were just, what, 25, 26?
I was really young. I was the youngest professional working on the staff at that point.
I don't think I remember, you from that young.
Right.
I mean, you've always been young.
Right.
And then you came back here, and then you became curator in 1996. And so I wondered if you could talk about your impressions of the library and special collections and of the town, from when you first saw it, not even thinking you'd be here for any permanent job, and then as you later came to see it.
Well, I have to confess, when I first came to the library in 1980, I was a little bit ambivalent about the whole setup. I felt like it was at a stage when it was, they had just gotten Barbara Powell to be the head of reference, and eventually, of course, she became the library director. But they hadn't gone all that far toward professionalization, and I felt like maybe the skills that I had at that point might have been mismatched to the situation. By the time I came back, around, I guess it was 92 that I came back, and I worked on a series of grant projects before I became curator. I felt like things had gone much further along the path of professionalization, and of course they had connected up to the Minuteman Library Network at that point, and so there were possibilities of online cataloging, and things just felt a little bit different. And at that point, I was also, when I was here in 1980, I was very much removed from the library staff. I didn't get a chance to really get a feeling for the institution and its history until 92, when I worked much more closely with Joyce Woodman, and I got a chance to watch Marcia Moss in action, because I was working in the room where they were working.
Right.
And so,
right, because the physical space wouldn't have allowed you to be in the other places.
Right,
anyway.
and I think that understanding something more about the history of the library and sort of seeing how the two of them approached questions and the sort of deep knowledge that they both had, it gave me a different perspective on it, and I stopped feeling ambivalent about it.
Did you think when you got your library degree after being at Wellesley and working with the woman who was your mentor, and you've been training in bibliographical skills and all this, that you would have a career at a independent research library or at a university library? And
I did, although what I envisioned was an academic library. That's what I knew, and those were the skills that I had. And I really didn't have that much experience with independent research libraries, and so this place was kind of an eye-opener for me. And of course, it's such a multitude of things to so many people. I mean, even down here in special collections, the clientele is so broad. I feel like we wear all kinds of different hats. And so it took a little bit of sort of broadening my perspective to step outside that academic library mentality and take on what it meant to be a staff member here.
What does the town of Concord look like from the lens of seeing it in special collections?
In 1980, it was a wickedly eccentric place. Because I would be upstairs only periodically, so I'd be seeing these little slices of life walking in the door. And I'd also be seeing slices of life at the circulation desk and the reference desk. And so, there were lots of characters on the library staff at that point. But, you know, I got to see and to meet very briefly sort of key people that Marcia Moss worked with. I got to meet Mrs. Maxfield Miller from Concord Academy, and I got to meet all kinds of other people who, you know, would be polite and introduce themselves, or Marcia would introduce them to me. I never got to know them very deeply, but it just seemed like this sort of parade of interesting and not altogether fathomable
Right.
people.
So you don't have to think about names, but what kind of things stand out as eccentric, wildly eccentric?
Well, people who always wore a hat and gloves to the library without naming names, you know who I'm talking about. People who had a certain outlook, I would say a highly privileged outlook, who probably didn't understand that that wasn't everybody's experience. It was just getting used to sort of the town life. People who no, I mean that's
Right.
yeah.
So no, it's fascinating because you know, we've talked about the way in which Marcia treated people. I think I told you my story about being here one day in the cage, and a homeless man came down who clearly hadn't showered for a good while and seemed vaguely off his meds if he were on it.
Yep.
And Marcia did ask me, would I stay and not go to lunch? She was a little concerned.
Right.
But she treated the man with such respect, and it turned out,
Right.
you know, whatever his mental issues,
Right.
he was so thrilled to be treated well, to be shown books.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that was the other side,
Right.
you know, that
That's right. I mean, there's the whole town, the whole social background of the town, and it's very different from an academic library, or it was. You know, there's a kind of intellectual snobbery that goes along with an academic library, but there's a whole different social snobbery that can happen in an affluent community. But as far as special collections went, Marcia and Joyce both were always very hospitable to everybody who came to the door. And I have to say, I modeled my behavior on that. And I have come to enjoy, over time, dealing with everybody who has any reason to come in here. I really do like talking to the pilgrims who, you know, come in to see a manuscript, or the people who just want to know what is this place. That's as important, I think, as helping somebody do their research. So.
Roland Robbins spent much of the Great Depression sitting in this library reading Emerson and Thoreau and painting houses.
Right. I remember Marcia telling me about that, and that was one of those coincidences, because I actually met Roland Robbins when I was, I think, 14 years old. I went off to science camp in New Jersey, New York, and one of the things that we had to do was to help him with his archaeological dig on a revolutionary blast furnace. And so there are actually pictures of me over at the Thoreau Institute with holding ingots and, you know, pig iron, and with streaks of dirt on my face.
Oh, that's
And yeah,
great.
I know. And it seems so odd, you know, when I realize, you know, it's one of those things where you feel like you're meant to be in a situation. I was a Roland Robbins groupie when I was a teenager.
So you've been digging around in the past, either
Yeah.
archives or the ground, for a long time.
Yeah, and honestly, when I was a kid, I used to say I wanted to be an archaeologist, and somebody asked me once why I changed my mind, and I said I really haven't changed my mind. I feel like documentary digging is archaeology, you know, every bit as exciting as digging for objects.
And the documents you find, you put on walls and exhibits.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right. It is, yeah, with a lot of interpretation.
That's
but,
right.
Yeah.
So I think people might want to know, if they were new to Concord, why there's this thing called the Concord Free Public Library Corporation. A lot of places in America have a public library. I think Baltimore and Philadelphia have free public libraries.
Yep.
But free and corporation don't often seem
Well,
to go together. So maybe you could explain that.
okay, well, I know you know the history of Concord libraries very well. And you know that there was actually a municipal library before the Concord Free Public Library, which was called the Concord Town Library. And it was set up when Massachusetts allowed towns to support public libraries through taxation. So that was 1851.
I think Concord was the first town to use that act.
You think so? Really? Well,
Well, first of all, it was early in the year. I mean, the bill just passed that year. And, you know, I think that Samuel Hoare was active in that. He was a member of Mass Historical Society.
well, that's interesting. We'll have to talk about that later. Yeah. And so the town library pretty much met the needs of the town for 20 some odd years. It was not a particularly ambitious operation. It didn't have its own building, and you know, it satisfied
And
people.
it sat in the townhouse.
Right. It's, well, townhouse, and it moved around a couple of times. And along about, well, the late 1860s, William Monroe, who had grown up in Concord, he was the son of the cabinet maker and pencil maker William Monroe, and had spent a long time in England working in dry goods and textiles, where he made fortunes and lost fortunes a couple of times, and eventually came back to New England and retired with a fortune and no wife and children to leave it to, and wanted to do something meaningful with his fortune. And he had, you know, he was very proud of Concord. He was very proud of its history, revolutionary history, and his family lived here in the Concord of Emerson and Thoreau. And so he wanted to set up something that was a little bit more fitting to the reputation of the town. And also, I think the fact that the centennial celebration was coming up probably played a role in this, in his desire to set up something a little bit more elaborate than the town library. And he very much wanted to establish what we would call special collections nowadays. That it was basically local material, because at that point there wasn't any local collecting agency. There was Cummings Davis, who had his collection, and the Antiquarian Society was coming, but wasn't there yet. And so William Monroe wanted to do this, but I think he understood that to bring in the kinds of things that constitute local history, those things might be vulnerable in a situation where there isn't some kind of checks and balances. And so he set up a joint private-public form of management, which he pretty much managed to politically sell over time. He had his detractors, and he had people who were suspicious of his desire to set up a private corporation.
You mentioned the other day, Edward Emerson was skeptical.
Yeah, Edward Emerson was very skeptical. Yes, he wrote a letter which, you know, he wasn't sure that, you know, it was going to be a free public library if there was a corporation that was. Yeah, right, right. There you go. So he, you know, he set up the corporation to own the buildings, own what in 1873 was called the valuable stuff, and then became over time known as special collections by the 1970s, late 1970s. And so what that means is that manuscripts and records, papers, artwork, photographs, all kinds of stuff that might be at risk in some situations comes in and is supported financially and stewarded really by the library corporation. And you know, people in town get the benefit of it, and a lot of people in town use it, not just you, not just professional historians, but people for all kinds of purposes. And it's not entirely their tax dollar that's paying for it. And I think it's one of the best kept secrets in Concord. I think probably 50% of the population here doesn't realize that there's a joint public-private form of management.
It might be worth mentioning here that forming a public-private partnership in Concord for broadly civic purposes was not unprecedented. In 1820, the town engaged in a partnership with the Corinthian Lodge of Masons to build the building that's there now. The bottom floor was the town grammar school. The upper floor was reserved for the Masons. And so that arrangement enabled the town to build the grammar school quickly after it burned down on New Year's Eve of 1820. And so William Monroe himself would have been too young to have known about that when it first happened.
Yeah.
But he wasn't doing something that hadn't been done in the town before. And it might be worth remembering that public private partnerships are actually of even longer standing here.
Right. Well, and then, I mean, at certain historical points, it was very important to the people in Concord. I think about the Depression and the 1930s. The corporation specifically decided to enlarge the library and expand the services because there was a depression and people needed access. People couldn't necessarily afford to buy books. They needed access to reading matter, and they needed a place to for kids to hang out and what have you. And so they fundraised and put endowment funds into expanding at probably the least likely moment in history.
Susan Orlean says in her new book, The Library Book, on the Los Angeles Library and the Fire, she quotes a librarian as saying, libraries are among the only places left in this country where people in a community can walk in and have access to. There's never any bar on, you have to have paid something to come in here.
That's right.
And, when you think about how civic space is used in America, it's really remarkable.
Right.
And Concord, all more so, because this library is located on a piece of land that's so central to the whole village.
That's right. No, it's a real community center. And in relation to special collections, I'm aware of it because people who know what special collections in general are like come in here and they want to ask, like, do we have to have an appointment? Are we allowed to use this if we don't have an academic purpose? And the idea that this part of the library is for everybody, the same as the rest of the library, is a big surprise sometimes.
I think you should take people in town on field trips, send them to go knock on the door at Houghton.
Oh yeah, and you get strip searched. Yeah. Don't put that in the article.
but the contrast would be,
Right. And
it would really
get
get people at town meeting to do that first and then come here.
Right, I know.
Do you have any counterparts in the state of Massachusetts or New England?
Well, not that I know of. I mean, the libraries that I think of, public libraries that have large or that have good special collections are big public libraries. The Boston Public Library has great special collections, but
whether they can find the stuff.
Well, that's a whole other story. I mean, in some sense, this is kind of like the funky Boston Athenaeum too. I mean, there are different models that have parallels, but they're not all public libraries, and so. I feel like it is unique, but I don't want to quite go out there and say that there's no other library in the country that's like this.
Right, so there may be, but it does have one, whether or not there is, that you don't know, it means that you've had this job with no colleagues in a counterpart.
Well, that's right, and actually that's the thing. I mean, no colleagues out there, and also no colleagues really in here. I mean, that's the one thing. You work in an academic library, and typically there are other people who share some of your body of knowledge and some of the things that you can do. And the thing about working in a very small operation where you're the expert is you're the expert, and that means that the buck stops with you, and you got to make the decisions, and you got to. It's.
Did it ever feel lonely? Like,
yes,
boy, I wish I had some help.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I've had colleagues in the people who've worked for me, and they've been wonderful, and they've had their expertise, but not the same kind of background that I have, and so yeah, it's felt lonely sometimes, but the manuscripts more than make up for it. So.
But you did something that probably grew out of your own interest in the job, but maybe was part of wanting to have colleagues, is you became a scholar of the materials that you also oversee. You've written so many things for journals of Thoreauvians, of Emersonians, and you've collaborated with people, and you created an intellectual community or intellectual annex to special collections.
No, I'm glad that you're saying that, and it's been deliberate that I've sort of made that a part of the job. I've always felt that in order for people to trust the person who's helping them, they need to respect that person and their knowledge, and that's really part of what I was trying to do. I mean, I love to write and do research, but it doesn't need to be a part of the job. But I think the more you know about what it is that people are working on, and the more they can tap your brain, and the more they feel like they can have a dialogue with you, the better, the more robust the situation is. And the more that people feel like they're getting great service, the more they are supporters of the institution. I think everybody, in the back of everybody's mind, special collections are the thing that can go when there's a shortage of funding, or when you want to reconfigure something. And so places like this need to always make the case for why they're important. And if you have people who are willing to speak up on your behalf, or to say why it's been important to them, and to say that they've gotten great service, then it's a protection. It's a form of protection for the department, the institution.
When you think from year to year about who comes here, about what proportion are local citizens of Concord or the neighborhood, what proportion are academics coming to do, projects like dissertations or books or articles?
I would say it's probably about a third local residents, a third academics from all over the place, and a third maybe regional people who see that we have these great resources that aren't in other libraries, so they may come over to look at the local histories that we have of their town, which are probably better than the local history selection in their library. So it's
Has that changed over time?
I think the thing that's changed is that genealogists don't come here so much anymore. They come for the pilgrimage experience, but they don't come to do the serious research, because they can get it all online. They can get a lot on Ancestry. And you don't need to come from California to look at the vital records of Concord that are printed and available in online form, or any of the genealogies. So. And in a way, I think that's good. I mean, it sort of lets them be the masters of their own research, and lets us focus on the stuff that's unique. I think, for me, the thing that's really important about these collections is not so much this stuff out here, but it's the unique stuff that's in the vault that people can't get anywhere else. And the depth of that material and the complexity of those collections is just amazing. So that's where we should be putting our resource, I think.
Are there, well, first, what are the numbers like for you, or how many people?
Well, we have pretty vigorous foot traffic here. We have it's been consistent. In the, before we did grant projects to do online cataloging for the manuscripts, it was probably about, 800-900 people a year. Once we started doing online projects, it doubled, and the use of manuscripts. As soon as we started putting on MARC records on the Minuteman database, and then those things got morphed into OCLC and Arlen, when Arlen was still alive. In 1 year, the use of manuscripts doubled. So
What, a couple thousand a year now?
yeah, so now it's between 1,500 and 2,000 a year. Yeah.
Yeah, if I hadn't been writing the last 2 years, you had me here every year. Okay.
You've been here plenty. Yeah.
What are there particular uses that people in town make of special collections that are stand out?
House history is huge. People want to know, and mostly they don't want to know in any great depth. They just want a summary of the history, and we can do that easily for them. There are all kinds of political initiatives, people who are, if there's a warrant article in town meeting, people want to research the precedents or whatever. And actually, right around this time of year, I think we have more of that kind of use than any other time of year. Some genealogy, but not a lot. People like photographs. They want to see photographs to see how the town has changed over time. We do have school groups that come in. It's not as many as I would like because it doesn't seem to be a favorable climate for school groups to be doing field trips to the library anymore. But we've had projects with kids, working on the turtle project, kids, all kinds of things.
I remember after I published the Minutemen that there was a period when I think 5th graders reenacted town meeting.
Yeah.
And the kids were all supposed to come here and look at minutes of town meetings to prepare for the debate. And Marcia was overwhelmed because they weren't well prepared by the teachers.
Right. Well, see, nowadays we don't have to worry about that because nobody reads script anymore. So that's it. That's out of the question.
So, you've done so many exhibitions. Are there, was there a philosophy in your mind about special collections that led you to do all these exhibitions?
Oh, yeah. I mean, once again, what's his name? Fabien Cousteau stopped by here a couple of weeks ago. He was being toured around Concord. And he gave me his card. And I think it said something along the lines of, people protect what they love, and people love what they know and understand. And so, what I want to do with exhibitions or programs or whatever is to sort of put it out there so people can see it, make a personal connection with it, get excited about what it means, and they start to understand, what it's all about. And there's no particular reason that they would. It's not intuitive to know what this stuff is for and what it tells you. And so, the exhibits, and of course I have a philosophy of putting lots of text on the wall. That's not the typical museum concept these days, but people aren't forced to read it. But if they want to know, they should be able to find out easily. And so
you put most of the exhibits online, haven't you?
No, we put a few online, but not all of them. No. But we've done some catalogs and tried to preserve the content in one way or another. So
one of the things I've been struck by is when you have openings of the exhibits, how you've tapped different constituencies in Concord for different exhibits.
Well, it's true. Yeah. I mean, these are wide-ranging collections, and they support all kinds of topics. There's some towny subjects, I remember one that we did on Concord, Lost Concord, Concord Bygones. Oh, that was like a big nostalgia trip. People loved it, and they loved it for different reasons than they, other people like collecting transcendentalism. That had a narrower audience than
you think?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But your commemoration of Thoreau's birthday.
That was a big one.
Huge.
That was huge. That was the biggest exhibit I've ever done. It had 150 items in it, and that pretty much pushed the limits of the gallery and also the limits of my energy. But
well, I remember the building, number of people who came for Laura's talk.
Well, I mean, Laura did an outstanding talk, and that's one of the things. I love having been able to rely on scholars like you and Laura and Joel and Sandy Petrolinas to sort of help make sense for people, for the general public, of what all of this means, and that really is my audience for the exhibits, the general public. I'm not doing this for scholars. I'm not doing it for school children. I'm just doing it for well-educated, interested people. And so,
well, you started getting more and more attention from GBH and other TV things.
Well, that was when we did the Wyeth collaboration. Yeah, I think that was pretty much the museum's draw, getting that kind of publicity.
So I know you talked about this, but for these purposes, say a little bit about what materials you have either that were in the collection when you got here or that you've acquired that you're most excited about showing people.
Okay, well, I think that the Nathan Brooks papers I find absolutely thrilling because they're like the whole panorama of 19th century, mid-19th century Concord. You know, they represent the elites and they represent the people who are going to jail because they couldn't pay their bills. You can use that collection to reconstruct what households were buying on a regular basis. You can see they were eating enormous quantities of meat and butter, and somehow they lived long lives anyway. You know, you can see the number of times that Nathan Brooks and his wife re-wallpapered their house. You can see all kinds of details of social history, and that to me, I mean, there's so much information there. That's pretty thrilling. The collection, I think that I'm probably, it's kind of hard. I don't want to say it's like picking a favorite child, but one collection that I like very much that's come in since I've been curator, the Pritchard papers. I just think that it says so much about the place of women in Concord life and the lives of women, not all women, but women of a certain economic status and educational status, and really how much like modern women those women were, despite the constraints that they faced in their daily lives. And they were funny and they were kind of smart-assed, and they were, you know, they were real people that you would recognize on the street as normal people. And it also, you know, the other thing about the Pritchard collection is that it's like little windows into the way the Concord authors connected into Concord life. And that, to me, that's so important, because the Concord authors are not the whole story of 19th century Concord. It's a rounded community. They have a place here, and you know, they're influencing the place is influencing them. It's not, you know, it's not like literary scholars want to do and put them up there and make them the story of the community. But you're a social historian. I don't have to tell you that.
Preaching is converted.
Right, exactly.
Actually, even calling the Pritchards an elite family
I know
is a stretch.
It is a stretch, it is.
Pritchard failed in trade when Burham Pritchard went belly up, and
he did.
He managed to recover chiefly because John Kydes got him an appointment as deputy sheriff.
Well, they were elite in the sense that they lived on Main Street and they educated their children very well, and their children didn't seem to feel constrained by, you know, whatever economic issues were going on in the family. The sons went off and did their thing, and the daughters. Moses
did, I think, come from some money because his brother Gilman was a fairly wealthy merchant in Boston, wasn't he?
Is that where the name Gilman for the middle? Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah.
I tried. Okay, so why do you think it's important for Concord to maintain special collections?
Well,
why should since you don't have counterparts,
I think,
and you're not in a big city research lab.
Concord history is something that a lot of people are interested in, and it's true that a lot of those people are not in Concord, but a lot of them are in Concord. People move to Concord because of its history. The history is part of the economic well-being of the town. It brings tourists to town. It's part of why people are here. Whether they like it for practical reasons or for idealistic reasons, it doesn't really matter, but it is part of what Concord is. And so the special collections are all about that history. That's what we do. All we do is Concord. I mean, I think sometimes people have a notion that this is, you know, we're like, you know, Antiques Roadshow or something like that, and it's, you know, it's got nothing to do with artifactuality and collectability. It's got to do with documenting a subject. the subject's important. I think it's probably important in different ways from the way a lot of Concord people may think of it. You know, I think it's the exceptionalism that people are looking at, but I think the way Concord compares with other places and the fact that it's representative in some ways of the history of other places, and it just happens to be better documented than most of those places, makes it's an imperative to sort of keep this documentation and you know, support the ability of people to use it.
Well, the space here is so beautiful and neatly arranged. It's of a piece with the building that's distinctive. And the distinctiveness of the building is part of a civic architecture. I mean, I've often thought it's so interesting that Monroe comes up with this plan and the building's erected before the BPL.
Right. No,
but
that's right.
As part of broadly a kind of Gilded Age impulse to that's civic in nature. Think all of American big cities, new library buildings or museums, they're all roughly 1880s, 70s,
Right.
80s, 90s. And I think Monroe had something like that, a real civic impulse.
I think he had a civic impulse, and I think he also had a far more cosmopolitan outlook than a lot of people in Concord at the time. I mean, he lived in England for a long period of time. There's one of the letters in the Pritchard collection, maybe you've seen it, is about a party at his brother Francis's house on Main Street, and William's there and Mary's there, and you know, the Monroes are having a good time, and you know, really putting on a good party. And one of the Pritchard sisters is writing about how William is handsome and charming, the most handsome and charming man there, and he's doing Hungarian dances, and he's, you know, it's an outlook, a much bigger outlook on the world than you might expect in what's still a farming town, a small farming town. And
yet some of that cosmopolitanism is tied to the things you've done with Ada Shepherd and with the whores going abroad, and the post-Civil War years saw, you know, the people with some means in this country really take off and, you know, travel and
right, that's true.
And the library's, I think, part of that. But the other thing you said is that I connect to is Emerson gave a lecture when the library was open, and he said to the people of Concord, you should invest in your library because people will want to live in a town with a good library. He said something earlier about the schools.
Right.
Invest in your schools.
Right.
You'll want to live in a town with good schools, and that will keep real estate values high.
Yeah.
And so the notion that support of civic institutions is crucial for sustaining a town actually goes way back to the mid-19th century, if not before.
Yeah. Well, and getting back to that subject of cosmopolitanism too, I mean, I think Emerson and Thoreau both said essentially the same thing, you know, that a good library makes a town as good as Paris and London and Rome, and, you know, it gives you access to the best of human thought in the same way. And so, yeah, they got it. They definitely got what's important about a public library.
Are there things that, as you're looking back, that you're sorry you didn't get to? That if you were going to put something on the agenda for your successor, you would say, here's some things we really should be doing?
Well, I wish I could have gotten every unprocessed collection processed. I think when I came, there were no such thing really as finding aids. They had a kind of an organization, a lot of them, and there were inventories and things like that. But collections hadn't been really put into condition to be readily accessible and usable. I mean, you managed to use everything anyway, but you know, it's only because it was in Marcia's head or Joyce's head, and they could help you. Now people can do it for themselves. So when we had our first big manuscript project from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission through that funding, I think we got something like 65% of the manuscript and archival collections processed and cataloged. And so over the years, we've made progress between staff members and interns. We'd make progress, but the collections have been growing like crazy. I think that we probably have at least a third again as much stuff as we did in 1996. That's a big growth over that period of time. And so I've never been able to get beyond 65% processed. And I feel like I wish I could leave a fully processed situation to my successor, should there be one. But it's, that's one thing that I wish I could have done. I wish we'd had more support for digital projects where we could really have undertaken things in a systematic way and really
redo those newspapers.
Yeah, well, right, yeah, right. I mean, but the website initially wasn't constructed to support anything ambitious like what we wanted to do, and so we worked with it and did the best we could. And I think the collections warrant a better web presence than they have at the moment. So I'd like to have done more that way, but not for lack of trying.
Are there any manuscripts that got away that you're...
Would I know about them? Anything?
Well, that people were bidding on and you didn't have the resources.
Actually, I'm pretty ruthless when I bid. So anything I bid on, I pretty much get. And as far as gift collections, there are a few collections that, donors can be funny. They like to do a dance with you, and some of them are serious and some of them are not, and sometimes there's a circling around for a period of decades, not just a simple transaction of, hey, I've got this stuff, do you want it? And so there are a couple of collections still floating out there. I think they may eventually come to the library. I won't name names, but I think by and large, the contacts that I've made with donors have resulted in donation. So that I feel really good about that, actually. I think that the fact that the collections have grown in a really meaningful way, and the fact that we've been able to establish some standards, pretty high standards of description here. That's the thing that those are the things I'm most proud of.
So last question. So what do you look forward to in retirement?
Oh, I look forward to having my time be my own, to do what I want. And the first thing I want to do is, I have a diary that that was kept by a woman who lived in our house during the World War I period. And I want to transcribe it and edit it and annotate it. And I may be the only person who cares about this diary, but I don't really care. I want to just revel in the experience of doing it without being interrupted.
That's great. And maybe she'll get as famous as Martha Prescott.
Probably not, but I don't care. I mean, that's not the point, actually. I mean, in all of this, it's the satisfaction is in the doing. It's in the work. It's in the doing of it. It's not in the end result. It's like when you write. Well, maybe I don't know how you are, but when I write an article, I love the research and the writing. Once I put it down, it's like I don't even care about it anymore. It's the process. So.
Yeah, I think, especially look at a document for the first time, and it's just confusing. A diary.
It is. Yeah.
How often do they record? What do they record? Who is this person?
Right.
Unless you have a finding aid that gives you a whole biography.
Right. No,
you just look, and then it takes a really long time to figure out what are the questions you should actually be asking about this document.
Yeah.
So many people go through and they say, well, I'm just interested in the Civil War. Oh, here's a comment on the Civil War, and you extract it.
Yeah, well, and when you have that aha moment, when you finally figure it out, that's pretty thrilling. I think one of the most exciting moments I ever had here was in the early 1980s when I was working on that first project. And cataloging Concord authors' books, and I would go up into the stacks to get some, material to figure out some information about Emerson or Thoreau, to figure out what to say about the books that I was cataloging. And I started noticing all these little foreign books in the collection. And I would pull them off the shelf, and I could see they were 19th century French and German and Italian books. And they had a book plate that said they were given by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody in the 1870s. And it took me a ridiculously long time to understand what they were, because some of them had book plates that said Foreign Library or 13 West Street. And once I realized that those were remnants of the famous Foreign Library at 13 West Street, I went wild. I mean, that was an exciting moment.
Really exciting.
Yeah. And then there was the whole pulling the books and organizing. That was less exciting. getting the project so that
the article you wrote on that was great.
Yeah. Well, I had fun with it.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
All right, we're
Last
good.
words?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.